Daf Pei Amud Beis, the Mishnah towards the top of the Amud. Zok the Mishnah Nisman to Eichel. The Mishnah is discussing the din of shituf from a voice, that in order to carry in the Movi, the Chatzeres, the members of the Chatzeres have to join together, pull together food, and make an Eruv, put it in a secure place in one of the Chatzeres to be able to carry in the Movi. So if they brought together, they made an Eruv, but then the food, the amount of the food became diminished. So before Shabbos, before the onset of Shabbos, the quantity, the amount of food got diminished. One person can add from his own food. He can add from his own food and replenish it, and he can do it on his own unilaterally. He doesn't have to. He doesn't have to ask any of the residents. And he does not have to notify the residents even if he's using their food. Meaning, since they joined together in an Eruv, they already joined together in an Eruv. Therefore, they joined together in the Eruv and they wanted to contribute to their food. Then, if it's nismayit, he doesn't have to get their approval from it. Since already they have joined in the shituf, so we know that that's what they want, and this is a benefit for them. You don't have to ask them, and you can use their food to replenish. And all the details of this we'll discuss in the Gemara. But if there were more residents that joined in to the Movi, more people came in and moved into the Chatzeres, and they want to use the Movi. So now, since there are more people, when you divide it amongst the number of people, the amount of food is not enough. It's below the minimum requirement. Then, he can add from his own food. But if he's going to use their food over here, then he does have to inform them. Since they were never part of the shituf to begin with, this is like initially joining the shituf for them, and therefore the consent is required. If he's using their food has to be accessible and available to all members of the Chatzeres. If he's using their food, then they need consent. The Rishonim, the Ritva, and other Ramban explain that that's only if there's not enough food. But if they are new residents and moved in, and there would be enough from the original amount of food that was used for the shituf, and there would be enough food if you divide it amongst all the people, including the new residents, there would be enough food, then nothing is required. But we're talking in a case over here where there's new residents, so therefore the quantity of food that's required is not enough to include these new residents. You have to add on to the amount of the food. If you're using their food, you have to get their consent. Kama Hishiurin, how much food must be used for the shituf? We are discussing if there is less or there more. What is the minimum shir? Bisman shehem merubim, when there are many people, many residents, mazon shtei sudas l'kulam, then all it's required is a mazon of 2 sudas, and you don't need for each member. For the entire amount, the total amount is a mazon of 2 sudas, and even if if you divide it amongst all the members, there would only be a small amount for each member, that's enough. That's enough. Even if by dividing it there would be less than a gregorius for each member, it doesn't matter. You have a chosh of a shir, you have a mazon of 2 seudas, which is a chosh of a shir, and therefore that is sufficient. However, when there are few people, there are not many people in the Chatzeres, there are not many residents, then Kegreis will call Echad ve'Echad. There has to be enough food so that if you divide it up, there would be at least a Gregors, a dried fig, for each and every member. That's the sheet of the Tanakama. Rabbi Yosi says, when is this said that you have to have enough food for all of the members, or you have to have this chashav amount of food? That's when you're initiating the Eruv. When it's the remnants of the Eruv, so when the Eruv has already taken effect, you put down the required amount of food for the Eruv. Then Shabbos, now is the onset of Shabbos, you had that amount of food. Whatever happens afterwards is of no consequence. If the food becomes diminished, then you can still carry in the Erev for that Shabbos, and even for subsequent Shabbos. Once the Erev has taken effect, once it became operative, then there's no more requirement on the amount of food. There's no minimum amount of food as long as there's a kolshu. Initially, when you make the Eruv, you make the shituv, you need a minimum amount of food. Once it took effect, then there's no minimum requirement. Now, the way Rashi is learning, there's a machlokes how to learn this, the Tanna Kamma of Yossi, to what extent they argue. Rashi is learning that they're arguing, and the Tanna Kamma says that for subsequent Shabbos, you do need to replenish it. You do need to replenish it. Only Rav Yossi says that you don't. For subsequent Shabbos, you do have to replenish it, even if it took effect for one Shabbos. Now, there's machlokes rishonim on that point, on that nakuda, but all of them agree that even the Tanna Kamma holds that once you had enough, the minimum amount of food, and Shabbos already came in, it's already the onset of Shabbos, then it is valid for that Shabbos. It's kosher for that Shabbos. That's not an issue. The issue would be only for the subsequent Shabbos. So Rav Yossi says, once the Erev has taken effect, even a kolshu is sufficient. They only said that you have to make a Erev Chatzeres, meaning if the Rashit is really, essentially, you do not need a Erev Chatzeres, because once you had a shituf, you've joined everybody together. So really, there should be no need to have an addition of Ruach Hatzeres. They're already joined together. Why is there a requirement for Ruach Hatzeres, even though you have shituf muvois, al kadesh le'ishakach as a tinakas, so that the children should not forget the din of Eruv Hatzeres. If there's no Eruv Hatzeres, the children will say, "Oh, we can carry in the Chatzer." There is no Eruv in the Chatzer. They won't realize that it's on account because of the shituf muvois. They'll think, growing up, that one can carry in the Chatzer, from the house to the Chatzer, even though there's no Eruv Hatzeres. So therefore, for the chinuch of the children, Shalei Shakach, the din of the Eruv Hatzeres, they made a requirement that even though the shituf muvois, you must have also a Eruv Hatzeres. Zok the Gemara b'mayaskina. What are we dealing with in the ratio of the Mishnah that says that if the food became diminished, you can replenish it without the consent of the other residents? What are we talking about? What kind of case are we talking about? If it's the same type of food which was used originally, and now you're replenishing it with the same type of food, why does it say only if it became diminished? Even if it was completely gone, completely consumed, and you have to replace it completely, still you do not need consent. And perhaps you'll say we're talking about you're replacing it with a different min, with a different type of food. So if that's the case, even nismait, even it became diminished, namiloi, that you cannot replace it without their consent. If it's a different type of food, you can't replace it without their consent. So what's the difference if it's the same type of food or different type of food? One might think, perhaps, one could suggest that if it's the same type of food, you don't need the consent, because once they've already agreed to it, and they want the erev, they want that shituf, and they're agreeable to use this type of food, we can assume that they will be agreeable to replenish it with the same type of food. If it's a different type of food, maybe that's something that they are more makbid on, maybe that's something that they need or want more, so maybe they would not consent to that. So that perhaps is a way of understanding it, but the Ritva explains it differently. He explains it that if it's the same type of food, it's just a continuation of the original shituf, and therefore you don't need consent. But if it's a new type of food, different type of food, it has the appearance of making a shituf to begin with, from scratch, l'chadchila, and there you need their consent. Al kol panim, if it's b'shnei minim, afilin ismait namiloi, even if it's only diminished, you can't replace it without the consent. The Sani we learned in the Brayso, kol ha'oichel mimin echad, the if the food that was used for the shituf is completely consumed and it's from one min, ain't tzorach l'idea. You can replenish it without notification. Base minim, tzorach lo idea. But if it's 2 minim, then you require to have the consent. So the Gemara is assuming that mishnei minim tzorach l'idea, even if it only becomes diminished and not completely consumed, then you still need the consent. Taisus points out, but the Brisa says that Loshen kol oichal memin echad. If it was completely consumed, it says that. So it says kol ha'oichal memin echad. Kol is that it's completely consumed. So why would we assume that we're talking about even if it's diminished? Taisus explains that we're assuming that if it's mishnei minim, even if it becomes diminished. That it says kola ha'oichel min completely consumed is to teach you that if it's min echad, even if it's completely consumed, but it's only one min echad, you don't need to get their consent, their prior consent. However, it's mi base minim, we're assuming at this point that what it means if it's 2 minim, even if it's not completely consumed, even if it's not kola, then you still need the consent. More answers, you can learn it whether it's 1 min or 2 min. If it's 1 min, that my nismayet, when it says nismayet, that in the Mishnah says it's nismayet, which means nismatmet. It means that it became crumbled. It means completely consumed. So really, perhaps we're talking about in the Mishnah where it's min echad. Nismayet doesn't mean literally diminished, it means nismatmet. It means that it became crumbled and completely consumed, and it's min echad, even though it's completely consumed, you don't need their consent. I could tell you that we're talking about 2 different minim, but kala shiny. But if it's 2 minim, it's davka. If it's kala, then we'd say that the lashon over there, the Brisa says kala means davka, and even by 2 minim, it's only if it's completely consumed. But if it's diminished, you don't need their consent. So perhaps the Mishnah is talking about case 2 minim, and it's nisma'et, it's only diminished, and nevertheless, since it's only diminished and it's not kala, then you do not need their consent. But if there were new residents that were added to the mavoi, then you have to notify them before taking from their food to add to the shituf. We see from here that the Chachamim argue with Rav Yehuda. This not because we learn in the Mishnah, Rav Yehuda says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Bamed, Vorim, Amurim. Where do you say that you have to notify them, the residents have to be notified, then, and I give consent, Bamed, Vorim, Amurim, Beru, Tchumim. That's only by Beru, Tchumim. Because it's not necessarily a schos, it's not necessarily a benefit for the person to join in a particular tchum. And tchum, everyone can join separately. One person has a tchum in one direction. Perhaps this person wants his tchum to be in a different direction, so he can walk in a different direction. It's not necessarily a benefit for the person to join in this area for the tchum, because who says he wants to walk the paimam in that direction, maybe he wants it in a different direction. So therefore, by tchumim, you have to have consent. But Eruv Chatzeres is a benefit. So therefore, you don't need consent. Now over here, our Tana says that you require consent for the new residents. So therefore, we see from here, Chalukim, they argue with Rav Yehuda. So Zaktimar, Pshita the Chalukim, well of course they're Chaluk. So what's your question? Why do you have to point this out over here? More answer is Ma'od, you might think Hanimil B'chalza Shabein Shneim voice. You might have thought that our mission that requires the consent, that's only if there's a chalzer between 2 mavois. There's a street here and there's a street here. It opens into this one, it opens into this one. So that in that case, it's similar to Tchumim, because who says that he wants to join in the shituf in this direction, maybe the other direction, or maybe vice versa. It's not a clear-cut benefit because perhaps he wants to be mishtatev with the other movli. But if there's a valchatzer shel movli echad, But if it's a chatzah that only opens to one mavli, it's a clear benefit. Without the shituf, you can't carry in the mavli. There's no alternative mavli. So that's a clear benefit. So I might have thought, I might have thought that our Tana would agree that in that case that you do not require consent. So maybe he's not arguing on Rav Yehuda. Kamashmalan Rav Shizri is telling us that even when it only opens to one mavli, still our Tana says that you must require consent, which is not like Rav Yehuda. Kama Ushiyura, what is the shear that you need for the shituf? So the Mishnah said that Bisman Shehem Merubin, where there are many residents, then you need Mazon Shtei Sudas. It's Mazon Shtei Sudas, it doesn't matter how much would be allocated to each person, even if it be only a small amount to be allocated to each person. If there's many residents and you divide up this two sudas, this amount of two sudas amongst all the residents, even if it only be a little bit, that would be sufficient. But if they're not merubim, if there's not many residents, then it has to be a groigris enough that each one would be able to contribute a groigris, a dried fig's worth. So come on, merubin. What's the definition of merubin? What are many residents? 18 people. 18 people in room. 18 and no more, only 18. Means from 18 and above. 18 and more is considered merubim, and if you have that amount of people, anything 18 or more, you only need a mazon shtei sudos, and that's the upper limit. You don't need more than that, even though if you did allocate it amongst all the residents, they'd only get a minimal amount. That's still sufficient, because mazon shtei sudos is a davar chashuv. Why did Shmuel say 18? Omar Rav Yitzchak Brei Rav Yehuda. They explained to me by my father, by Rav Yehuda, the following way: if it be large enough, that if you would divide the mazon shtei sudas b'neiim, then the number of the residents are so many that if you would divide up the mazon of two sudas, there would not be allocated for each one a dried fig, a groigris hein merubin. That's what's defined as merubin. The sagi mazon shtei sudas, and you don't need more than two sudas. Two sudas is enough for all of them. But if there aren't so many participants, and then the dividing up the mazon shtei sudas would yield a groigris or more for all the residents. Hein muatim ninu. These are kin muatim, and therefore all you need is a dried fig. So it's enough to have a dried fig for each person. That's enough. The upper limit is mazon shtei sudas. So if you have mazon shtei sudas, you don't need a groigris for each person. But if you don't have a mazon shtei sudas, if mazon shtei sudas would yield more than a groigris for each person, you don't need mazon shtei sudas. A groigris for each person would be enough. So we're making. And you tell me something, incidentally, that the shtei sudas have an shmeina esrei groigris, that the two sudas, mazon shtei sudas, is the equivalent of 18 groigris worth of the food. And it's telling you that milsa agav orchei.